Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into something truly intense. We are going to explore one of the most harrowing psychological descents into absolute isolation ever recorded. Settle in, because we're uncovering the terrifying, true story of a man literally marooned at the edge of the world. I want you to really think about this for a second. Could your sanity withstand 4 years and 4 months of absolute unending silence? Now, we all know the story of Robinson Crusoe, right? Daniel Defoe's noble hermit who just calmly builds a nice little island life. But the real man who inspired that myth? Oh, he went through a living hell that would have broken most of us in a matter of weeks. All right, Section 1. Unearthing Lost History, the Archaeological Frame. Before we officially meet our castaway, let's briefly establish exactly how we know his incredible story is real. As the Santa Cruz Archaeological Society points out, archaeology is constantly excavating reality right out of myth. Whether that's finding ancient grid gardens in New Mexico, identifying an 1841 sunken Spanish slave ship using wooden Cavacova dolls, or literally unearthing 22,000 ancient nomadic gold artifacts in Afghanistan, archaeology separates fact from fiction. And it's exactly this kind of rigorous science that eventually proved the truth of our island castaway. Moving into our next section, Mutiny on the Cinque Ports. Let's see how that scientific rigor unearthed a legend, starting with a very bitter feud out at sea. Let's look at the facts. On one side, you have Defoe's romanticized castaway, but the gritty truth of Alexander Selkirk, it is far more brutal. There was no Man Friday to keep him company. There were definitely no neat, perfectly tailored goat skins. The real Selkirk was a desperate, desperate sailor battling complete madness. He used feral cats for protection against massive swarms of rats and ran around on thick, bare, heavily calloused feet. Here is exactly how the timeline played out. Selkirk's journey kicks off in 1703. He was the sailing master of a privateer ship called the Cinque Ports. But in 1704, he got into a massive, explosive argument with his arrogant captain, Thomas Stradling, over whether their rotting ship was even seaworthy. Because of this, Selkirk was marooned on the remote Juan Fernandez archipelago. He wouldn't see rescue until 1709. And tragically, his life ends just years after that, dying of yellow fever off the coast of Africa. Now, he actually demanded to be left on this uninhabited island, and he was given this incredibly meager starting inventory: some bedding, a musket, a Bible, a little tobacco. He honestly thought a friendly ship would scoop him up in a few days. Well, he was wrong by about 4 years. But ironically, this stubborn decision absolutely saved his life. The captain who marooned him sailed off, and the Cinque Ports sank almost immediately. Almost the entire crew drowned, or they rotted away as slaves in Spanish prisons. So in a weird twist of fate, Selkirk's isolation was literally his salvation. Which brings us to Section 3, Madness and Rodent Invasions. Because surviving the Spanish was a walk in the park compared to the agonizing battle against his own mind and the island's nocturnal terrors. Those first few days were just a monotonous nightmare. I mean, imagine it. His mind is completely deprived of external stimuli, of human speech, even of the alcohol that sailors back then were basically addicted to. So his mind began to devour itself. He went through severe withdrawal, terrifying hallucinations, and was pushed to the absolute brink of suicide. He would frequently just sit there with his gun pressed to his head. To keep himself from completely snapping, he forced strict discipline on himself. He started reading his Bible out loud just so he wouldn't forget the English language, and singing psalms into the totally empty valleys. But, just as he'd scraped together the will to live during the daylight, the nights brought this whole new horror. Hordes of invasive black rats, left behind by previous ships, would absolutely swarm his camp. Attracted by his scent, they would brazenly gnaw at his clothes and literally bite his feet while he tried to sleep. And that intense sleep deprivation, it was exhausting him way faster than the hunger. But then nature stepped in with a brutal yet elegant solution: symbiosis. Selkirk ingeniously started luring feral cats, again left by past sailors, with little scraps of goat meat. He basically built this purring protective barrier of dozens of cats all around his hut. The rats absolutely did not dare cross this feline wall, which finally let him sleep. Plus, building this bond gave him companions to care for, which actually restored a huge fraction of his mental balance.
Next up, becoming the apex predator. Watch how, over time, Selkirk transforms from this frightened, weeping sailor into the undeniable master of his island.
So, the island's humid climate eventually rots his original clothes completely away. He's facing the very real threat of navigating thorny scrub completely naked. His solution? An absolute miracle of primitive engineering. He pulled a rusty nail from an old ship's chest, spent hours painstakingly grinding it against stones until it formed a sharp needle, and unraveled his old stockings and leather tendons to use his heavy-duty thread. Boom! 3 steps, and he sewed himself thick, functional armor out of raw goat skins.
500. That is the number of wild goats Selkirk hunted down during his stay. And get this, he caught a ton of them entirely by hand. See, when his gunpowder finally ran out, his body had to adapt. The soles of his bare feet grew these thick, almost armor-like calluses. All his excess weight completely melted away. He essentially morphed into an Olympic-level runner. He could sprint full speed across razor-sharp volcanic rocks and literally tackle agile wild goats right to the ground. He truly became the island's apex predator.
Though that newfound speed definitely almost killed him. Once, blinded by the pure adrenaline of the hunt, he was chasing a goat through thick bushes and just ran right off the edge of a hidden cliff, plummeted dozens of meters. He lay unconscious for days, but miraculously broke no bones. Why? Because the very goat he had just tackled acted as a living shock absorber, crushing beneath him and cushioning what should have been an absolutely lethal fall.
And goats weren't the only thing he had to worry about. He had to evade human predators too. At one point, a Spanish punitive detachment actually landed and spotted him. What followed was a deadly race through the jungle. With soldiers actively firing their muskets into the brush, Selkirk scrambled high up into the canopy of a massive tree, completely blending in with the leaves. He spent hours hiding up there in dead silence, while the heavily armed Spanish soldiers rested and, get this, even urinated directly on the tree trunk right beneath him. Talk about a close call.
All right, Section 5, Return to Civilization. After more than 4 years of this relentless survival, the horizon finally brings salvation. But as we'll see, it came with a massive psychological cost.
Fast forward to February 1709. 2 English privateer ships, commanded by a guy named Woodes Rogers, finally drop anchor. The rescue party is met by this wild, shaggy creature totally clad in goatskins. Selkirk was so overwhelmed by seeing people that he could barely even speak, just stammering these half-forgotten English words. He was even completely disgusted by the taste of the rum they offered him. But physically, oh, he was vastly stronger and way more resilient than the entire scurvy-ridden crew that just rescued him. He ultimately makes it back to England as a wealthy celebrity, pocketing an 800-pound share of pirate booty. But he hated it. London's noise, the dirt, the vanity, it all deeply repelled him. He couldn't even sleep in a soft bed anymore. He actually dug a cave in his parents' backyard just so he could sit and look at the sea. It all led to this profoundly tragic realization he shared with a writer. I am now worth 800 pounds, but shall never be so happy as when I was not worth a farthing.
And that brings us to our final section, the archaeological evidence. Because you might be wondering, how do we actually know the highly specific details of this crazy, almost mythical survival epic are true?
For centuries, dramatic illustrations of a wild man in goat skins really fueled the myth, until the real story was totally overshadowed by Defoe's fiction. But recently, modern archaeologists, including David Caldwell from the Scottish National Museum, actually traveled out to that remote Juan Fernandez archipelago. Their goal? To finally separate Defoe's romantic fiction from Selkirk's harsh reality.
And they found it, high up on a volcanic hillside, about 300 meters above sea level, a spot where Selkirk could safely watch the horizon for ships. Archaeologists dug into the dirt. They unearthed charred bones, old post holes, and then the ultimate proof, a tiny 1.6 centimeter piece of bronze. It turned out to be the damaged tip of a navigational divider. That tiny piece of metal is the irrefutable physical proof of Selkirk's lonely 4-year vigil up on that mountain. Alexander Selkirk completely conquered his island, but in the end, he kind of lost to civilization, tragically dying of yellow fever back out at sea just a few years later. His story really forces us to look hard at our own dependence on society. So, I'm going to leave you with this question. If you were banished to the edge of the world tomorrow, what 3 items would you bring to survive absolute isolation? Think about it. Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.